Welcome everyone to the first webinar in a two-part series about on-farm variety trials to manage risk for organic and specialty crop producers. This is your host, Alice Formiga of eOrganic. eOrganic has many articles, videos, and webinars about organic farming and research, and you can find all of our resources on our website at extension.org/organic_production. This webinar is being recorded and it will be available within the next week on the eOrganic YouTube channel, along with many other recorded webinars and videos about organic seed production and other organic farming topics. In this webinar, you'll be introduced to the practice of variety trialing and how to plan a trial. I'm very pleased to welcome back our presenters today, Julie Dawson, Kit Healy, and Jared Zystro. They will speak for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have about 30 minutes for your questions, which we'll be reading out loud after the presentation is over. Dr. Julie Dawson is an assistant professor for urban and regional food systems in the Department of Horticulture at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her research focuses on variety trials and breeding for organic systems in the upper Midwest. Kit Healy is the Organic Seed Alliance Research and Education Associate for the Midwest region. Her master's research focused on conducting tomato variety trials for short-season organic production and engaging chefs and local farmers in participatory breeding and evaluation projects. Jared Zystro is the Research and Education Assistance Director at the Organic Seed Alliance. He manages organic seed system development in California, conducts participatory breeding projects and variety trials, and teaches farmers about seed production at workshops, conferences, and field days. So now I'm going to move on to the main presentation and pass the screen control over to our first presenter, Kit Healy.
So today the presentation that we've got for you is about variety trialing. So if you're hoping for a different presentation, then you might have clicked on the wrong link. But today our presentation is titled More Trial, Less Error, and we're going to talk about how to choose the best varieties for your farm. And before we jump into the how-to element of the presentation, which is mostly what we'll be discussing, I wanted to just provide a little bit of context for why we're talking about variety trialing and why in the bigger picture, doing variety trials and then potentially doing on-farm selection and plant breeding is something that folks might be interested in and might be getting more interested in learning about. And the goal really of what we are doing with our trials and with our kind of projects is to increase the resiliency of organic systems or of the agricultural system in general. So going back 12,000 years, seeds are at the intersection of our biological and human systems. The more we pay attention to the plants that we're growing, the more we observe them, the more we can select for the qualities that are beneficial to our particular environments and our particular management systems. And obviously that's something that's been going on for as long as farming has been going on. The elements of a resilient system that we have listed here, diversity, redundancy, decentralization, and flexibility, apply just as much to your farm as they do to the seed system in general, as they do to ecosystems in general. And one of the things that we are hoping for in trying to increase folks' capacity to do variety trials on farm is that we can continue to grow the amount of diversity, redundancy, decentralization, and flexibility in the seed system in general. This, of course, requires a shift in our thinking about agriculture away from just how can we produce, as much as we can this season to how can we continue to sustain ourselves and our farm systems in the long term. So diversified farmers, many of you on the line, I'm sure, count yourselves in this category, already have this figured out, right? We already understand that we need a diversity of crops, we need a diversity of genetics, we need people, from different cultural backgrounds growing our food to help ensure that our food system is going to be as resilient as possible into the future. But we don't often talk about how the broader seed system influences, your average CSA operation. And that's one of the things that variety trialing can be an introduction to starting to think about. But I believe so. Bayer acquired Monsanto. Dow and DuPont have merged. Syngenta was acquired by a Chinese company. So we just have a lot of consolidation on the seed landscape. And going back to our words on the first slide, this all means that the seed system is now more centralized, less diverse, less flexible. And some of the work that we and our partners are trying to do, and then that all of you are interested in, is to try to counter that trend. The efforts of smaller seed companies that are coming on the landscape, and some of the work that's being done at universities, like the University of Wisconsin-Madison is the university affiliated with, in addition to Organic Seed Alliance, and there's a lot of work being done there to try to decentralize the seed system all over again, right? To have people who are on farms selecting their own varieties, and then smaller regional seed companies that can be paying attention to the changing conditions in both market conditions, ecological conditions, climate conditions that are all constantly in flux. But ensuring that regional seed systems are strong, so that we can have that kind of decentralized, redundant seed system that will be beneficial to all growers in the future. Okay, that works. Okay, great. So these are some of the seed companies and nonprofits that have emerged in the last few decades to kind of counter this consolidation in the seed industry. And I'm sure that many of you purchase seed from these companies and are well aware of their existence and of what they're trying to do. But the point of this slide is just to demonstrate that there are really a lot and a growing number of smaller, or regionally focused or focused specifically on organic seed companies popping up all over the country and all over the world to ensure that more farmers' needs are reflected in the seed that's available to them. So in trying to work with these seed companies, obviously more organic seed options, more diverse options, more novel varieties are coming on the market. But it is a little bit intimidating when growers have these few varieties that they have been growing and have been reliable for often for many, many years. And then to try a new variety, to try something that, say, has been bred specifically for organic systems, or something that has been bred for your region but isn't necessarily carried in your favorite catalog. We did a survey to try to understand what growers need to know about a crop before they try a new variety. What are the things that they're most interested in understanding before they take that risk to try to get something new into their fields? So we did the survey in 2016 and got responses mostly from the northern tier of the country, as you can see, but from a wide geographic range of organic farmers. And these are the results that we came up with. So interestingly, the way to interpret this graphic is that the larger the font, the more people responded with this quality as the thing that they are most interested in knowing before they try a new variety. And flavor was something that people were very interested in. They wanted to know, have other people tried this, and does it taste good? Before I'm going to put it in my field, I want to know that it's going to make my CSA customers happy. And then the other things that people were interested in are, a little bit more agronomic qualities, like days to maturity. Is it going to fit in my region? Is it something that's actually going to yield in the time that I need it to? Disease resistance and yield being things that most folks are interested in. And again, so those qualities are important across the board, but how they display themselves is going to vary depending on the system that they're grown in and the location that they're grown in. So some things to keep in mind when we're thinking about how we choose the best variety for our farms. Environmental adaptation is very important. Is it something that is going to do well in my short season, or do well in my very long dry season? Is it suitable for the particular agricultural system? So if you're an organic farmer, or a low input farmer, or if there's something particular about the way that you grow, making sure that your varieties that you're using are actually suitable to the system that you operate within. And then, is it going to meet your market needs? Are your customers going to be raving about this beautiful pepper variety that you've brought to market? Or is it going to be something that is too for people or too conventional for people? And keeping those market needs in mind is something that we think about when we are doing variety trials. So where to start doing trials on your farm? Variety trials are a great way to evaluate what's out there on the landscape, to see what potential varieties you could begin to include in your annual rotation. Is there a variety that already exists that could work better than what you have on your farm? Or is there a variety that's almost good enough, or a variety that works maybe in the spring but not so much in the fall, and then you could complement different seasons, which is something we'll talk about more in depth. But oftentimes we think that there's nothing out there that works for our farm, but there might be something that works that's just from a seed company that we don't anticipate it being from, or even from our neighbor who saves seed. So there's a big spectrum of where we can find things that work on farms. Now, in beginning to talk about variety trials, oftentimes there's a barrier to people who are interested in doing variety trials. They understand how it fits within the whole seed system and why it might be beneficial, but there are often some hesitations, like, do I have enough time to actually do a scientific experiment on my farm? Do I have the space? Do I need 10 replications to be able to do this? And is that going to take up my whole production space, and then I'm not going to be able to grow anything else? Do I have the knowledge to actually design a trial, to understand what it means to replicate or not? And then when you end up with data, what do we do with that? It doesn't analyze itself, and it's not always clear what the results are just from looking at the numbers. And I think these things often lead people to think, well, shoot, maybe I need to work with a researcher to be able to do a variety trial. But really, though, what we're presenting today are things that you absolutely can do on your own, that you don't need to work with a university, that can be designed. These variety trials can be designed so that they fit within the flow of what you're already doing on your farm, so that it's not going to take up a lot of extra time, or will take up an amount of time that's commensurate with the results that you're interested in. So at the bottom of this slide, it says that clearly defining your trial goals will help keep the whole process realistic. So if you're sort of marginally interested in yield, you're more interested in flavor, then you don't have to take up all the time to weigh all of your yield. Your trial really can be designed so that it fits within your expectations and realistically within the time and the space that you have to devote to it. So the next few slides come from Cattail Organics, which is a farm, Kat Becker's farm here in Wisconsin. And she has done trials all along the scale of formality, from just, planting some new varieties in the field and seeing how they do, to a fully replicated variety trial with a university researcher where lots of measurements were taken and statistical analysis was done. So she has a great perspective on trialing, and she has lent us a few slides. Also, in our variety trialing guide, which is published and is available on the eOrganic website, we have a case study of her farm that we'll go over a little bit here. So Kat is a CSA farmer, and she, in her variety trials, she asks herself a series of questions before deciding what to trial and what to focus on. She looks at the markets and the strengths and weaknesses that she has within her offerings already. So what are the most important crops economically? If you make a ton of money on tomatoes, maybe it's a good idea to try to trial tomatoes and understand what are some of the best varieties that work in your system. At the same time, maybe you want to try something that's not that critical economically because it doesn't get as much attention as something like tomatoes, where there's a lot of effort put into determining what are the best varieties. So that one could go either way. The other things that Kat recommends looking at are seasonal crop weaknesses. Like if you have something, you have a lettuce that works really well in the spring, but it totally falls apart when it gets into later in the season, and you need something that can replace that. You can look specifically for different times of the season. Or say Kat gives the example that she just has a really hard time growing cauliflower on her farm, and she wants to try to trial different varieties that could make that a little bit easier for her given her specific growing conditions. Other things to keep in mind are if you have a change in growing methods, so you want to try something in a protected environment, like a high tunnel, or you want to try something under a different tillage method than you've used before. You might want to add a variety trial to ensure that the varieties that you're using are the best ones for these growing methods that you've adopted. She also recommends thinking about a potential to increase the production of important crops, so anything that you're already, making a good amount of money on and that you want to amp up your production of. There might be some different varieties that you could integrate there. And if there are new markets that you're interested in, reaching out to a different variety selection could also help with that. So for Kat and cauliflower are tricky for her, so she's done a lot of trialing of those. Her cut lettuce, she also has found out that she requires very different varieties throughout the season and learned that by doing variety trials at different points in the season. So she'd plant the same trial in the spring that she would plant in the middle of the summer, that she would plant in the fall, and then compare how the different varieties did across that time, and then changed a growing mechanism to mechanical harvest and needed to find new varieties for that. Let's see. Oh, there we go. Sorry, I realized I was switching slides in a different program there for a second. Okay, so these are the ones that I just talked about, and then the farm plan for trials. So this, I think, oh yeah, Julie's taking over in just a minute here. But so when Kat goes to plan a trial, the things that she recommended are reviewing her seed plan from the year before. So looking at the notes that she had taken on different crops throughout the season. And then going back to this idea of redundancy that we talked about earlier, there might be a variety that you are particularly dependent on. And as we've seen with something like Nelson carrots, where a lot of people were growing Nelson carrots and then the seed was no longer available. And that could happen, and that particularly happens with organic seed, that varieties can just be dropped. So oftentimes it's good to have, if not be growing many different varieties, to at least have the information to know that you could switch to a different variety. And then there are this is also especially true if you are paying attention to your organic seed requirement, which requires that growers use organic seed unless there is no alternative that's commercially available that does as well on your farm. So this is the organic seed rule, and it can be paying attention to this rule and ensuring that you're meeting your organic seed requirement is something that variety trials can really help folks out with, because it can either help you identify an organic variety that does just as well as a conventional variety that you might be pretty attached to, or it can help you demonstrate to your certifier that there is no equivalent variety available, and that you need to communicate that information to the plant breeders and seed companies that you work with to help ensure that organic seed can become available. That works really well for your farm. So just a few things to remember before turning it over to Julie to get a more in-depth idea of how we go about designing variety trials. Keeping your most important goals in mind is definitely the key to success here. Ensuring that you're not getting too distracted by things that might be nice to know, but that might take up too much of your time and might jeopardize your ability to actually your trial that you've set up for yourself. How much time and depth can you give to it? And what are you trialing just by observing that you might want to consider doing something a little bit more rigorous or scientific with in the future, so that you're kind of progressing season by season through your trialing plan, and making sure that you're covering the things that are actually going to be the most significant to you moving forward. So I think now I will turn it over to Julie and we'll get into the specifics of variety trialing.
Great, thanks, Kit. So Kat Becker has been doing variety trials with us as part of a project with UW-Madison for a while, and she has a really great way of kind of framing the variety trials that she does that I like, and think is useful for other farmers. So in talking about variety trials, there's a series of there's different complexities, and so we're going to kind of talk about that that progression. When you get down to actually making a plan, it's important to think about it in as much detail as possible at the beginning. An extension agent I work with, Claire Strader, likes to say, trust your winter brain, because your winter brain thinks clearly about things, and your summer brain may be a bit frazzled by all of the things that have to go on the farm. So trying to get as many specifics down as possible is good, and create plans for your trials so that when you get to the middle of the summer, you remember what the most important data is to collect and why you're collecting it. When you're creating a plan, try to keep it simple. If you're starting trialing and this is your first experience with trialing, choose 1 or 2 varieties. If you're doing a new crop, which you've never grown before, don't do that one for a trial. Try it first with a few varieties, or one variety maybe that people recommend, and learn how to grow the crop first, and then try to do a variety trial to find an optimal variety. But if you're at a point where you experiment a little bit, keep your trialing plan simple, and remember to have fun. It's not supposed to, it is a little bit more work, but it's not supposed to be an onerous task. You should enjoy the variety trialing and do it partly because you want to find interesting new things. And part of what I enjoy about variety trialing is usually there's something unexpected and really interesting in there. So Kat breaks her trials down into 4 different types. One is just trying new varieties, things that look interesting. Usually you're already doing this. So if you see a new variety of cherry tomato that looks really cool in the catalog, you might put in a few plants just to see what it's like. That's kind of the most basic level. When you really want to get to a point where you know that what you're seeing is reliable and repeatable, then you might want to go up to screening trials or replicated trials. Screening trials are more systematic, so you're trying varieties in a way where you are trying to get kind of information on the key traits across a variety of planting windows or across your field. You're trying to address a specific need, and so you seek out varieties according to that priority, and then design the trial around that. Replicated trials are where you're trying to get more reliable information on traits that have some kind of environmental influence. So yield is a good example of a trait that has a lot of environmental variation due to soil fertility or the weather in a particular year. So it can be a trait that's more important to do a replicated trial to get good information on. Replication doesn't have to be complicated, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. But replicated trials are often a step up from screening trials once you've kind of identified what varieties might be good. From a screening trial, you can move them up to a replicated trial. And then finally, in Kat's kind of classification of trials, university trials are ones where you're collaborating with a university partner or a nonprofit partner and a number of different farms. These trials might be screening trials. In the Seed to Kitchen project here in Wisconsin, they are designed as screening trials. They could be replicated trials. They could be measuring many traits or just getting qualitative information from you. But some of the benefits of participating in a university trial might be that you see something new that you wouldn't have picked out on your own, and you can maybe talk to other growers in the network who are also trying those same varieties. So university trials are kind of in parallel trialing that you might do on your own farm with your own objectives in mind. So the basics of trial design, keep it simple, don't try too many varieties. All of us have to learn how to do trials. Even those of us who are researchers did not start knowing how to do trials. So you can start small in your first year and move up to trialing more varieties or trialing things in a replicated way, or you can just keep it simple and address specific questions on your farm. You want to pay very close attention to where you're putting the trial. That's probably one of the most important things you can do, is pay attention to where you put the trial. You want the trial site to be as uniform and as representative as possible as the rest of your farm. The goal of trialing, variety trialing, is to determine whether some varieties are better than others for the particular traits that you're looking at. You want to know whether this variety is different than the other variety because of the variety, not because it was in a better part of the field or it got more irrigation water or anything else. So anything that's not the variety that could cause a difference, you want to minimize. So you want to minimize differences in soil fertility, soil type, prior crop management. All of those things are sources of variability that are kind of confounding or noise in your trial. There are kind of two different aspects of this noise variation. One is environmental variation. That's your soil type and other aspects of the farm. And then there's management variation. I'll talk about that in the next slide. So to minimize the environmental variation, it's useful to look at your field the year before you do a trial to see if there are areas that are problem spots where you might have a dip that's collecting water, or a gradient that is higher fertility in one end or the other, or a patch that's just got a big thistle problem. All of those things can add noise, and they're easier to see kind of the year before when you have a uniform crop with all the same variety planted there, or maybe a uniform cover crop. Try to pick an area that's as uniform as possible for your trial, and try to avoid the edges. So any edges of the field can be subject to more variation than the middle of a field. They're also subject to slightly different management. Often they're at the end of an irrigation line, or where your tractor turns around. So try to put the trial kind of in from the edge a bit. It doesn't have to be smack dab in the middle, but it should be in enough so that it's buffered from any of that edge variation. In terms of management, you also want to make sure you manage the trial uniformly. So that means higher crop. So same species the year before. So you don't, not the same species as you're trialing, but if you're planting a tomato trial, maybe the year before it was all in broccoli or all in a cover crop. You wouldn't want to put it on a field that was half potatoes and half carrots. You want to use the same management practices as you would on your regular crop. So if you're doing tomatoes, same pruning techniques, same trellising techniques, same preventative measures for disease control, same mulching techniques. You want to make sure you're identifying varieties that do well in your particular system. And so you want to manage them the same as you would other varieties in that of that crop. And then when you do something to the trial, if you harvest or if you spray for preventing late blight, do it all on the same day. So don't spray a few rows of the trial one day and then go back and do the next ones the next day. Don't harvest part of the trial one day and do the following day. So try to keep everything as uniform as possible. Same goes for things like irrigation and weed management. You really want to minimize any variation that's not the variety. And that helps you see the differences in the variety more clearly. Things like replication, they help you take out and kind of measure and take out some of that environmental variation, but replication can only do so much. And trying to get the field uniform and really put all the varieties on a level playing field is probably the most important thing you can do to getting good information out of your trial. So I'm going to talk in a little more detail about screening trials and replicated trials, so the kind of two middle types of trials that I listed earlier, and give you an idea about what it would take to do one of these on your farm. And then Jared at the end is going to give some case studies of real farms that have done trials. So screening trials, you have one check variety that's replicated. This should be the variety that you are relying on in your normal production or trying to replace. It should be a variety you know well. And screening trials may be all you need for traits that are less sensitive to the environment. So color, if you want to find the carrot that has the deepest orange color, for example, Flavor has a little less variation from one side of a field to the other, although it is sensitive to weather conditions. Things like that, you may only need to do a screening trial. Things like yield or disease resistance, you probably will do a screening trial and then move the best varieties up to a replicated trial. And replicated trials are all of the varieties planted multiple times across the field and are a little more labor intensive, so it's good to take the time to do a screening and narrow it down to only a few varieties that you're going to do in a replicated trial. For screening trials, you would pick which variety you want to replicate based on which one you know and like the best. You want to have this variety be something you're familiar with because you're going to use it as a benchmark for all the other varieties, and also to determine whether the trial conditions are similar to other conditions that you've seen. So if that variety typically is very resistant to the diseases you see and it falls apart in the year of your trial, you know that you probably had very strong disease pressure. If it usually is susceptible to a disease and it doesn't get any, then you might not have really experienced that disease that year. So you kind of use it to judge the year and the location, and then as a benchmark for the other varieties. You need to have a uniform plot for this because you're not replicating all of the varieties, you're less able to account for environmental variation across the field. So if you have a gradient in soil fertility or in water pressure on your irrigation line, you're not going to be able to adjust for that as well. Although you can use the 2 check plots or the 3 check plots if you're replicating a check 3 times at the top and bottom of the field to judge how much of a gradient is present. The benefits of the screening trial is that you can test a lot more varieties. You're only planting 1 plot of each, you're only taking notes on 1 plot of each, so you can actually do more varieties than you would with a replicated trial. But you will probably have less precision on a lot of the information than you would in a replicated trial. So oftentimes a screening trial serves as a first look at a lot of varieties, and then you choose maybe 2 or 3 to then do a replicated trial with the next year. It's still very important to have a buffer or a border around the trial, so either putting it in the middle of your production field or planting the same crop around it in a couple rows to make sure that you don't have those edge effects from being at the edge of the field that could influence your results. With replicated trials, you've picked out a few varieties that are looking promising for the trait that you think is most important in your trial, or the few traits that you're looking at for your trial. So if you think you want something with a high fruit count for tomatoes, good flavor, good disease resistance, maybe you have your standard variety number 1 and you've picked varieties 2, 3, and 4 out of your screening trial that you want to test in a more robust way. So then what you would do is pick a uniform field, like for any kind of trialing. Our field is shown here, and I've put in green what we do with the borders. Since we don't have a big production field of tomatoes, and all of our tomatoes are trial tomatoes, we plant the first bed in a buffer row, and then 2 plants on the side of each bed as a buffer row. And that helps us minimize some of those edge effects. And then within that, you could plant 1 bed per variety, randomized as you see on the map here. Variety 1 could go across 1 row in the back, variety 2, variety 3, variety 4, and then you randomize the next rep, variety 3, variety 1, variety 4, and variety 2. Sorry, this pointer doesn't respond quite as predicted. So say you have a gradient across the field and you're trying to use replication to minimize the effect that that gradient would have on your results. You're a little worried that there might be greater fertility on the top end of the field than on the bottom of the end of the field. So this part is a little more fertile and this part seems to have plants that are not quite as robust. So rep 1 would be in the back of the field here, rep 2 would be in the front of the field here. It's important to put the reps in the direction of the gradient so that you're capturing that gradient, so that each variety will experience both the lower fertility end of the field and the higher fertility end of the field. If you put the reps here and here, you wouldn't actually capture that variation. So you want to put the reps so that they're lined up with the direction of the gradient. What this would look like if you were collecting count data, for example, would be, you could see that rep 1 here in the blue is lower count than rep 2 in the green. So the lower fertility part of the field overall is less productive than the higher fertility part of the field. When you averaged out those two reps, basically taking the average of rep 1 and rep 2 of the same variety, you could see that variety 1 and variety 2 were lower performing and variety 3 and 4 are higher performing. In the next webinar, we'll talk a lot more about data collection and interpretation. So this is just to give you a sense of what replication accomplishes. If you didn't replicate, and you just planted all of variety 1 up here, 2, 3, 4, what you would end up with is seeing variety 1 as definitely the worst, variety 2 and variety 3 as indistinguishable, and variety 4 is definitely the best, which would be misleading because it shows that, or at least if you don't replicate, it looks like variety 1 and variety 4 are more different than they actually are, and you might discard variety 3 even though is just as good as variety 4. So that's one of the reasons why you would replicate if you wanted something data on something like count or yield. Other traits might not be as important to replicate, and so it's good to do a screening trial first, see if that gives you enough information, and then go to a replicated trial with fewer varieties if you need it. So Jared is going to give more details on planning and how you would go about planning the details of your trial, and then some case studies. And like I said, on the next webinar, we'll talk a lot more about what to do with the data once you've collected it.
All right, thank you so much, Julie. So I'm Jared Zystro, and I'm going to take over, and just really briefly, I think that both Julie and Kit did a great job covering a lot of the planning aspects. What I'm going to be talking a little bit more about here is specifically looking at how you choose your varieties. So ultimately, the value of your trial, there's lots and lots of things that make a trial more or less valuable, but if you don't have the right varieties in the trial, then your trial loses quite a bit of value, because unless you are growing it and seeing it, you don't know. There may be something that in fact is better out there than anything in your trial. And so making effort at the start to include the potentially best material possible in your trial is critical to ending up with trial results that give you good information and lead you to success in your farm. So to begin with, you want to think, as Kit and Julie have already alluded to, you want to make a plan and set some goals. And some of this starts by prioritizing. So you may grow many, many different crops on your farm, and those crops, to conduct a trial of all of those crops is probably not going to be realistic in a given year. And so thinking hard about, what are the priority species? What are the crops that really could benefit from a variety trial? And what are the crops that you are going to be able to get enough benefit from to be able to make it worth your while to conduct this extra bit of effort that a variety trial represents, in the middle of your season, will be, important to make good choices there. You also want to think about not just the species, but, the crop within, or the crop type within that species. You want to narrow down on a specific market class so that you're comparing apples to apples. Having, in general, if you have a a tomato trial and you're growing, heirloom brandywine types with Romas, with cherry tomatoes, and you've only got, 5 entries in your trial, and each one of them is a different market class, it becomes very hard to get any good information out of there. So think about, what is the market class that you want to prioritize conducting a trial of this year, and try and just select largely within that class. You want to think about the goals of the trial. What do you want to answer at the end of this trial? What are the traits you want to be looking at, and how important is it to be able to distinguish them? At that point, you want to think about how to, what varieties you want to include. So how do you maximize the likelihood that you're going to have really varieties that are going to be successful in your trial? So you, as a farmer, I'm sure have a lot of experience already in your crop, and can draw on that experience to be able to include good varieties in your trial. But a trial is also an opportunity to take a chance and include things that you've never looked at before. And so some of the ways to get that information is to think about, okay, what are important varieties that that other growers in your region are likely having success with. So how do you find that out? One way is if you've got local representatives of seed dealers in your area, they can be a great resource. Obviously, they want to encourage you to try stuff that they're selling. So if there's more than one of them, contact a few and try and see if there's any consensus among them. If you've got a network of farmers through something like a farmers market association or a local growers association, or just through other nonprofits or informal community groups, or just through your own network of friends, pick their brains as much as possible, find out what varieties they're growing and why. What slots are they putting them in? What are the flaws of those varieties? Try and get as much detail as you can from people. If you also may want to look outside of your region and look at varieties that may be very popular, because ones that are stable and perform well across the country, one of the advantages sometimes of those are ones that can perform well in a range of environments, which means they may be, if you've got concerns around climate uncertainty in your region, being able to pick ones that do well, whether it's cold or hot, wet or dry, across the country, those ones might also perform well in your farm, regardless of if it's a cold or hot or wet or dry season. So to look at national top performing varieties, contacting national seed dealers that sell to farmers of kind of your market class, whether you're CSA or farmers market or wholesale, contacting seed dealers that sell across the country and getting their input. Again, same idea, contact multiple seed dealers. So of course, each one is going to be trying to pitch their own varieties. Also looking at if there are any national trials that have already been conducted in your crop, and look at what some of those past results are, could give you some clues about national top performers. We generally also recommend looking at some of the older standards, things that have been held in catalogs for many years. Those ones, there's often a reason why they've held on for so long. They're often considered to be quote unquote workhorse varieties that perform reasonably well season to season. And of course, if you've got any of your own varieties or breeding projects that you're working on, you'd want to take advantage of a trial and test them against these top tier varieties. So with that information about choosing trials, the next thing that I wanted to go into was talk a little bit about a couple of case studies, just to give everyone just some good examples of how an on-farm trial might look. So I've got a couple of them, and I chose these because these were both trials that I participated in, but were really driven by the initiative of the farmers that I worked with. So the first one here is a green bean trial that I did with Eddie Tanner at Deep Seeded Farm in Arcata, California. And Deep Seeded Farm is a CSA farm, grows for about 350 members, has a very long season, grows many, many different crops. And they were looking to identify a one or several green bean varieties that could slot into their farm system. Some of the the challenges of their farm is being able to find varieties that perform well in a under fairly high disease pressures, and that would yield well and that had high quality. So going through with Eddie, identifying, okay, what are the goals? What would a successful green bean variety look like? The top priorities were wanting beans that produce nice looking beans throughout the fruit set, so staying straight from early harvest through mid and late harvest, regardless of how where they were in the harvest window. Looking for ones that resisted white mold, which was an issue on their farm. Looking for ones that tasted really good, again, because that was an important criteria within the CSA. Wanting ones that were easy to pick so that they snapped off freely without damaging the pods during picking, and then having a good harvestable window, so being able to have good yields over a 2-week pick period. Once we went through that list of goals, went through this process of contacting, looking at varieties that they had grown in the past, contacting seed companies, contacting other farmers in the area, contacting breeders, and we came up with this list of varieties. We were trying to source as much organic seed as possible, although Deep Seeded is certified organic. They make an effort to follow organic practices, including each year increasing their organic seed usage, and so went on a hunt to find what was available organically. So this was kind of the list. There was a mix here. You can see of some that are the more dark glossy beans like jade, with some that are more the blue lake type. We included 3 experimental lines from Oregon State as well. And so once we had this list of, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 varieties, we looked at how we could lay this out within the farm setting. One of the challenges at Deep Seeded is that as a fairly high there's a lot of over the course of the year, relatively limited land base, and so space is at a premium. So we needed to look at how to maximize the value of this trial within the space. And how we set it up is ultimately it was a replicated trial with 2 replications on 2 beds, and each of the plots were 10 feet long because the bed length was 150 feet, so we were able to fit the 15 varieties in 150 feet, and both of these were randomized within replication so that they weren't planted in the same order. And when we get to the next webinar where we talk about data collection and analysis, I'll continue this example to show you how we collected and analyzed this data. My other example that I wanted to share with you was spring wheat trials that I conducted in conjunction with several farms in California. with the College of the Redwoods farm and with Front Porch Farm. College of the Redwoods being in Shively, California, Front Porch being in Healdsburg. Both of these farms had been doing small scale grain production, primarily dry farm, with with local markets as the end goal of these. Both of the farms had relatively limited land base, but were interested in producing high quality wheats that would perform well under kind of organic conditions and under relatively high disease pressure again. So some of the goals that were identified by the farms were wanting things that yielded well under relatively low input conditions, both in terms of water and fertility. Looking for resistance to stripe rust being one of the number one issues for production in more coastal areas of California for wheat. Wanted decent weed competitiveness, primarily by having varieties that would grow relatively quickly and end up with final plant height being high enough to outcompete many of the weeds, and then quality being a very high priority. So this being something in terms of milling and baking quality, so protein, test weight, and then more subjective measurements of quality based on bake tests. So based on those criteria, and also a desire ideally to find things that were available as organic seed, were available without having intellectual property restrictions like plant variety protection or patents, or plant back restrictions from contracts. We went through and found a mix of hard red and soft white varieties that had been performed well in other organic farms in the past. And so for these trials, because yield was one of the primary criteria, and because the yield of wheat can be so variable within a field, the decision was made that we would actually replicate this 4 times, so that each variety would be planted 4 times in the field, and the width of the plots was 8 feet, which was just a function of the seeder and the combine that we had available, and the plot lengths were 100 feet here. So we had relatively large plots, and they were replicated, and the goal of that again being because we wanted to be able to distinguish between these varieties based on yield, and having more replications was important to be able to differentiate, as Julie said, between the effect of the environment, especially as these were being dry farms, so small differences in existing soil moisture could have big impacts. So those are a couple of examples of how these trials were planned and how they were laid out. And then again, when we get to the next webinar and talk about data collection analysis, we can pick up on these examples and see exactly how we measured those traits that were important to us and how we then analyze the results. So with that, I think turn it over to Alice for questions.
Yes, we're going to start our question and answer period, and we'll be reading the questions out loud until we run out of time. Also, I wanted to mention that you can learn even more about variety trials by going to the Organic Variety Trial Toolkit page, which is at the link on your screen. There you can find a new guide published by the Organic Seed Alliance on how to conduct variety trials, as well as a tool that can help you plan and manage your variety trials, and other helpful resources. Finally, part 2 of this webinar series is taking place on April 11th, so I hope you can all join us then. So moving on to our first question. Is the University of Wisconsin doing any hemp trials?
Yeah. So there's a state pilot for industrial hemp in Wisconsin, I don't believe there are any variety trials at the moment. I'm not planning any in the near future.
Can you talk more about how to do replications in multi-site trials?
Yeah, so you could certainly do a multi-site trial where each site was its own screening trial if you have the same replicated check. So each person would plant 2 plots or 3 plots of the same variety and then 1 plot of all the others, and you can compare notes. You can also do a trial across sites where you have replication within each site. And so the replication within site controls for field variation that is basically nuisance. It's noise in your data. Differences between sites, though, can tell you what is different about varietal adaptation to those sites. So you might have a very dry site and a wetter site, or a site that's in an urban area and a site that's more rural. And differences between those sites might indicate that certain varieties were better in one location than the other. Variation within a site, where it's variation from one end of the field or to the other, is usually something that you want to minimize or get rid of as much as possible, because it's not going to help you make a decision. Whereas, having a different variety than your neighbor, down the road on a different soil type might actually tell you that a different variety works better for you than for them.
I would just add on a kind of logistical platform side. If I would make a plug, if you're looking to collaborate to do trials with other gardeners and farmers, I've been a big fan of. There's the Experimental Farm Network, that is a community-based tool for people to find each other to conduct variety trials. So if you take a look at that, experimentalfarmnetwork.org, you can join up and either sign on to be, participate in one of the existing projects, or, propose your own projects.
And I'll add one thing onto this also for this question. That another thing to keep in mind, and we're going to talk more about this in the next webinar, but when you're collaborating or when you're just having multiple people working on data collection, to standardize the way in which you're taking information and the way in which you're storing information as much as possible, because even within a farm crew that is all working together every day, there ends up being a lot of variability in how people are observing the different entries into a trial, and we'll definitely get more into that in the next webinar.
How can farmers participate in the University of Wisconsin trials?
So if you're participating in the Seed to Kitchen trials, and if you're interested in participating but haven't before, just send me an email. I'm sure my contact info is on the website. If you're participating in those trials, we try to make them as flexible as possible. So lay them out in whatever way is most convenient for your farming operation. The most important thing to remember is to keep the trial conditions consistent, so uniform trial site. If you do them in the same row, it's best if you do them in blocks along the row. You need to be able to tell where a plot starts and where it stops, and remember which variety is where. If you have any specific questions, just send me an email. I'm happy to help any of the farmers in those trials lay out their plot so that it fits in their system.
Does the University of Wisconsin provide seed for trials?
Yes, we do. There's a sign up link on my website, dawson.horticulture.wisc.edu, or you can email me. We have a number of different crops and market classes, and then we provide 4 or 5 varieties with the seeds, the stakes, the data sheets. We take qualitative data, so we ask people, would they grow it again, how well it sold, what the flavor was like, what the production was like, and then you're free to take whatever other information you want from the trial, and that feedback we take to the breeders so that they know what people are looking for, and we also share it with the other farmers in the trials. So if you're interested, just go to the website and fill out the Google form. It's pretty simple.
Are there any restrictions on sharing information from the trials?
Not for our trials. If you are doing trials with a seed company, there may be some restrictions on sharing the information. I'm not sure. But for our trials, one of the conditions that we have for people putting varieties in the trials is that the data becomes freely available.
Yeah, and I would just say that sometimes what you'll find is that depending on, and this is more common with field crops. So I've come across this with wheat trials, and I've done some silage corn trials where when you receive seed, it comes with a license or contract, and when you look at the fine print of it, it may say something about the ability to, conduct or publish research on the varieties. So if it says that on there, I've generally, if I wanted to include that in my trial, I've generally had success just coming back to the company and saying, look, I'd like to include this in my trial, but your contract's telling me that I can't. Can we amend this contract?
What is the most common problem that farmers have in conducting variety trials?
During the season? Jared or Kit, you may have
Yeah,
other...
I would second that. One of the things that I really strongly encourage is thinking hard, in this planning process about, only biting off as much as you can chew, both in terms of the scale of your trial, how many varieties you're including, and in terms of the, complexity of and timing of the data collection. You want to make sure that you're, doing, enough that the results are meaningful and useful, but not so much that you give up on it in the middle of the season.
How important is sanitation in variety trials?
I'll start, and I think you guys can add on to this, but I would say that just ensuring that whatever you're doing to one variety, you're doing to all varieties. So if normally on your farm you do some kind of sanitation or priming, and that's an important part of your management practices, then doing that just the same to your trial varieties would be important, as long as you're doing it the same way.
Yeah, I would emphasize what Kit said, and I think it's generally applicable to, anything you're doing in your trial as much as possible. You just want to manage your trial as closely as possible to the same way that you'd be managing that crop normally. So, don't try and prime your seed or treat your seed if that's not something you're already going to be doing, because if you end up with certain results from your trial based on, you know, kind of special extra steps that you're taking just for that trial, then, at the end of the day, you'll say, well, but I don't know, how would this actually do if I grew it in, my normal practices?
I think one place where you might want to think about sanitation is when you're getting seed from a lot of different sources that you're not familiar with. So if you're getting seed from seed companies where you've been buying seed, or other people have been buying seed for many years, you probably don't need to worry as much about sanitation. If you're getting seed from a lot of different sources, then you don't want to introduce disease into your field that you don't already have. And so there you might want to look into doing some more sanitation with the seeds.
Do you conduct trials for nutrient density?
I think some people measure nutrient density. That if you're actually measuring the nutrients, that becomes more expensive. We evaluate flavor with the idea that if people like the taste of something, they'll eat more of it, and then that's important for nutrition when we're talking about fruits and vegetables. But there are some trials and breeding programs that measure nutrients. It just gets expensive when you're doing a lot of samples.
About how much does it cost to do variety trials on a farm?
I think it depends. We have been trying to track labor for ours, and ours are more in depth than we would need if we were only looking at one characteristic. And it probably costs about $100 to $150 in labor, not including materials. But it depends on the crop. Lettuce is a lot easier than tomatoes. And if you're doing it for your own use, you can still sell the produce that comes out of that trial. So
it really varies on your goals and how long you spend on it.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I mean, the other thing I've noticed, the big difference between, say, something like lettuce and some of the field crops is that when you start talking about any kind of lab analysis, like the, trying to get, you know, quality data for the wheat trials or quality data when I've done silage corn trials, adding in, a per sample, lab costs makes things a lot more expensive.
The other thing too to add on is that if you're looking at a crop where you need to look at a larger number of plants to get a good idea of the variation within a certain variety, then your seed costs might be higher. And this is just another way, I guess, to plug our variety trialing guide, which is also on the website, which has within it a table that shows how many plants per variety you need to look at for a bunch of different crop species to get a representative idea of what a variety looks like in your field. And some of them, there's quite a lot. So if you're doing 3 reps and say it was something at 40 plants per rep and it wasn't carrots where it's easy to grow 40 plants, then you might just be investing a little bit more, especially if it's organic seed.
Thank you, everyone, for all the questions. As I mentioned, you'll be able to find the recording on the eOrganic YouTube channel, along with many other webinars about organic seed production. And we hope you can attend part 2 of this webinar, which is taking place on April 11th. In the meantime, I hope you can take a look at the Organic Variety Trial Toolkit and read the new Organic Variety Trials Guide, which you can find there, published by the Organic Seed Alliance. So thank you so much to our presenters, Kit Healy, Julie Dawson, and Jared Zystro, and thanks to everyone for joining us.